Hey guys, Julian here from Ripehouse. Thanks for clicking on this video. If you haven't already, we have a new podcast called the No BS Property Investing Podcast. Make sure you go check it out and give it a listen. Now back to the video. Welcome back to today's video. And we've got a question here from Joseph. It's just how easy is it to rip equity out and move into another deal? So essentially what Joseph's asking here is in terms of you've got a property, it's gone up in value, and how easy is it to leverage that equity growth to help you purchase another property? So I guess firstly, it's actually pretty easy to a degree, right? So we still need to, and the reason I say that to a degree, what we're able to do out there, and I see this pretty commonly, is you could technically valuation shop. So what I mean by that is you might go to one lender, second lender, third lender, and if they're doing desktop valuations, you could get three very different prices come through. And I know where I've had certain clients where they're getting properties valued significantly higher than what their property is actually worth, and they're using that desktop valuation to take the equity out to help them secure a purchase. But if we look at this example here, so we've got a property valued at $800,000, the loan balance is $500,000, and so the total equity is technically $300,000. But in terms of available equity, so even though there's $300,000 of equity in the property, most banks aren't going to let you just rip all that money out because they want to have a security or a deposit against that property. So without paying any lender's mortgage insurance, we're going to go up to 80%. So that gives us $140,000 of available equity, which we can then use to help us fund the next purchase. Now, I guess the benefits of extracting that equity, and I guess what we would use that for, we might look to use that as a ready-made deposit. So we can go out and take that $140,000 that we've got there from our equity release, assuming we have the servicing to do so, to use it as a deposit to purchase our next property. But we might not use all of that $140,000 in terms just for the deposit amount. We might only put down to 10, or the magic number for investors around that 12%, where we reduce our LMI component. But then it's also going to assist us to cover off the stamp duty, cover off our building and pest, our conveyancing, potentially our buyer's agent fee. So we can use that equity growth to essentially purchase a property without saving for an next deposit. The risks that might come through that, because that's another question in terms of, how easy it's to rip out equity. There are some risks involved. So I guess firstly, are we using that equity to make an investment purchase, or are we using it to fund our lifestyle? So this is where some risks come involved. So when you're using that equity and leveraging that for an investment purpose, that equity release, assuming you're purchasing in your personal name, and this is not financial advice, obviously, but that equity release has now become fully tax deductible. So you can utilize that to, I guess, reduce your taxable income. But if you're going out there, you're using it to buy a jet ski, buy a new car, go on a European holiday, whatever it might be, you're giving up that equity. You've essentially removed that equity. You've now created also yourself a loan to pay on that. And that gets into the negative impact on the cash flow component. So just because we have equity, call it monopoly money, some people like to call it out there, it doesn't mean, however, that there aren't repayments to be made on this property. So as soon as we do that equity release and we start using that money, you will now need to start repaying that loan. Now, in some instances, it might just be the interest component on that loan. It might be the principal and interest component on that loan, but it's not free money. So there is going to be a loan associated with that. So it is going to have a negative impact on your cash flow. But then we also need to understand the real market value. So this is where I talk about it can sometimes be very simple to rip equity out of a property. So I've actually seen many clients rip equity out of properties far greater than what they got from doing renovations on a property, because they've just shopped multiple desktop valuations, and one lender has been way off the pace with their desktop valuation. And to give you the exact example, this client's property was worth $850,000. They were very, very certain it was worth $850,000 because their neighbor next door sold for slightly above that price, and their property wasn't quite as good as their neighbor. So let's just say it's around that $850 mark for the sake of this video. But then they've gone and shopped some valuations, and one of the lenders' desktop valuation has come back at $1.1 million. So essentially, they've got themselves a sizable amount of equity that they can tap into. Now, the risk that we run, we can absolutely yank and do an equity release against that valuation, assuming it gets through the bank, if they're just happy to accept the desktop valuation. But the risk we run is that's not the real market value of the property. So for whatever reason, if things don't work out the way, when someone gets sick, injured, we need to sell that property off. We're not going to sell that property for that $1.1 million mark. We're going to be getting maybe $850 come sale time. So there's going to be that difference there in terms of what we need to pay. So when we pay back the loan, that is. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. That's one of the big risks that can be involved. Now, there are people out there where they run their whole almost investing philosophy of quote unquote buying under market value. But the reality is what they're doing is they're buying properties where the desktop valuation might be more favorable with certain lenders, and they're just utilizing that to go from one property to the next. The risk that they take is that their property probably isn't worth that at a resale value. They've then also got that negative cash flow component. It might be great to leverage to buy a second and third property if your goal is just to be able to sit at a dinner party and talk about how many properties you own. But the reality is you've then exposed yourself to a lot of risk. You're highly leveraged, potentially beyond the point of the property's value. So it's just about understanding the risks involved in that. But thanks for submitting that question, Joseph. If you guys haven't already, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now.